Okay, hello. Um, this lecture is going to be about sovereign debt, a classic model of sovereign debt by Christina Arellano. So let's get going. So where are we getting this lecture from? Well, I'm going to lecture from a quant-econ particular lecture. It's actually the last lecture now on the web page. So here it is. And again, you can find it on the quant-econ website. And I'm actually I printed out a version here, and I'm gonna talk from this so that I can mark it up. Okay, as usual. So here we go. So this is gonna be a model, calling it, you're gonna see it's basically a consumption smoothing model where the debt is not risk-free because the person that borrows has a choice of whether or not to repay, decides to repay, and it will repay only if it's in his interest. There are going to be consequences of repaying, and there's going to be consequences of not repaying. And those consequences of not repaying are going to create incentives for repaying. That's going to be the structure. So we want to see what consequences are built in. So let's dive into this. Again, this is a model due to Christina Arellano in the Journal of Political Economy in 2008. So here's her vision. There's going to be a decision maker, and the decision maker is a government. And the context is it's a government in a small open economy, and it's going to borrow from an international market of many lenders, and those lenders are risk-free. They're risk neutral. And all those lenders want is they want to get a certain rate of return on average. So they're looking for an expected return, and they actually don't care about the risk. So that's what we mean by risk neutral. But if there's default risk, the foreign lenders have to be compensated for this. So this is all going to be about default risk, and the default risk is actually going to be chosen by the government when it decides what the probability that it's going to pay is. So this is all going to be about the probability of repaying, and the government's going to choose that probability. So what the government's going to do is it's going to borrow and lend in order to smooth the consumption of its citizens. That's what it's doing here. The government repays its debt only if it wants to, but declining to pay has adverse consequences. And the whole model is designed to see how the severity of those adverse consequences affect both the inclination to pay, and consequently the default probability, and consequently the interest rates that a government pays on those loans. So these are all things which were on Alexander Hamilton's mind in the early 1790s when he and George Washington proposed their program for rescheduling the debt. And when they talked about lowering the interest rate on federal debt, they had in mind increasing the probability that the government was going to pay, which would prompt lenders to lower the interest rate. This is what this model is all about. So the interest rate on government debt adjusts in response to state-dependent default probability chosen by the government. So Arellano's model is really about the same circle of ideas that Alexander Hamilton and George Washington were preoccupied with. So what this little model is going to do is going to yield outcomes that help interpret sovereign default experiences, mainly applied to Latin America in this case, about countercyclical interest rates on sovereign debt, countercyclical trade balances, higher volatility of consumption relative to output that various Latin American countries like Argentina, that have struggled with debt default have experienced. And there's also going to be long recessions caused by bad draws in the income process and how they increase the incentives, government's incentives to default. Okay, so this is going to lead to various interesting features: spikes in interest rates, temporary loss of access to international credit markets, large drops in consumption and welfare, and even large capital flows during recession. All of these things are issues in modern analysis of sovereign debt in countries ranging from Argentina to various African countries to the Ukraine and so on. But they were also very much on the mind of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. So let's show you the model. So what our tools are going to be, this is going to be a modification of a model that we've seen earlier. Either the Barrow tax smoothing model or the Milton Friedman permanent income consumption model. And if you view the Friedman permanent income model as a baseline, you're going to see we're basically going to modify that baseline. Okay, so let's dive into the model. So here's the deal. And our tool is going to be dynamic programming. We're going to see another Bellman equation in a value function that's going to take us to the real heart. And I don't want to emphasize the technical features too much, but I think now, because in previous lectures we've used the Bellman equation when we did the linear quadratic dynamic programming and got the value function, the optimum value function for those problems. We're a little bit familiar with that technique, and we might as well get some rents or benefits from knowing that. And this Arellano model is ideal for that. So here's the setup. It's going to be a small open economy, and there's an exogenously fluctuating potential output stream. And we're going to see why we call this potential. And we're going to make that potential output stream a stochastic process, and it's going to be governed by a Markov chain. So, but this potential output is fully realized only in periods in which the government honors its sovereign debt. When it doesn't honor its sovereign debt, we're going to see it doesn't realize its potential output because there's some punishment that the international community administers that lowers output below potential output, and that's going to be the consequence of not one of the consequences of not repaying. How severe that punishment is going to be an important feature of this model that's going to drive outcomes and interest rates. Okay, so the output good can be traded or consumed. And again, there's going to be a Markov process. And this is just a fancy word. There's going to be a Markov chain that gives us the transition probability. If we're in state Y today, potential output is Y today, it's Y prime tomorrow. So this is what this means. This is tomorrow and this is today. Okay. So we're going to assume, making lots of simplifications, the households within the country are identical. They all consume the same amount, and they rank, what they care about this is expected utility. There's a utility function, U of CT, and the people in this country, and therefore the government, wants to maximize the expected discounted utility of consumption. So there's a consumption smoothing motive, just like there was in our Friedman permanent income model. We want a consumption smooth. That's what's built in here. Beta is a time discount factor, and U is an increasing concave function. So U looks like that. And that gives us an incentive the desire to smooth consumption. So these consumption sequences are going to be influenced by the government's decision to borrow or lend internationally. And we're going to adopt a convention or fiction that the government is the agency inside the country that borrows on the behalf of its citizens internationally, and it issues sovereign debt. By the way, this is quite an interesting assumption to make, because in many cases and throughout the world today, governments did borrow or do borrow on behalf of their citizens by issuing sovereign debt. So Arellano adopts the stark assumption that the government's the only domestic actor who has access to foreign credit. Okay, so what's the asset markets? So there's going to be only one credit instrument, and it's going to be a one-period bond, and it's traded in international credit markets. Now we're going to modify a little bit what we assumed in the Barrow model or in the Friedman model. The bond's going to mature in one period, and it's not state contingent. If you purchase a bond with a face value B prime next period, it's a claim to B prime units of consumption next period. Okay, but if you purchase B prime next period, what it costs you now is Q B prime. And Q is going to be the price. It's the price now of a claim, but now this claim is actually risky to B prime units of the consumption good next period, because the country is going to decide whether or not it wants to repay that. We're going to see. So it's a claim to B prime units of the consumption good next period if I pay. Okay. So this is going to be if I pay. Okay. So the idea is if B prime is negative, that means I'm selling claims next period, and that means I get goods this period. Okay, so there's a typo here. This should be a prime. So that's what this looks like. If B prime is less than 0, then for a promise to repay B prime, that's what it costs me. And so what there's going to be is there's going to be an equilibrium pricing function. So the country is going to Q, this price is going to be a function of how much I borrow or lend, the country can borrow or lend, and what the current level of income is. So this price actually depends on how much debt I issue. If I issue more and more debt, I'm going to actually get fewer goods. My promises are going to be discounted. So Q is actually going to be a discount, this price. And if Y is higher or lower, that's going to affect my price. And the whole model, the whole focus is what does this function look like? We're going to study that. What does this function look like? Why does Greece perhaps get much less for a promise to repay next period than Germany does? And this is all about this price. So the government's going to earn some earnings on its portfolio, or it's going to have to pay some earnings on its portfolio, and it's going to get those by lump sum taxes or transfers to the public. That's what's assumed. So this is the government budget constraint right here. So what it says is consumption today is equal to it's actually going to be equal to your income today. And actually, I'm going to put this like this. It's actually equal to your income H of Y today. there's a typo here, and I'm going to tell you what H is, plus the amount that you have to repay. Well, this is when the government is not excluded from financial markets. When the government not, then this is the budget constraint. So if you're not excluded, you get your, if you're in the financial markets, and we're going to talk about this function H or Y in a little bit. If you're not excluded, you get your potential output. You get whatever claim you purchased yesterday. If B is negative, it means you owe money and you have to pay it. And then these are your new borrowings. And so these are the claims, and this is how much you get. There's the price. And we're going to rule out Ponzi schemes. So we're going to make the technical assumption that the level of your borrowing has to be less than or equal to some number Z. There's a limit on how much you can borrow. Okay. So what are the structure of financial markets? Foreign creditors, the people that lend, they're risk neutral. They know the stochastic process for output. They observe the history of your output. And the foreign creditors can borrow or lend in an international credit market at a constant interest rate of R. They have deep pockets. They can borrow or lend. They receive full payment if the government chooses to pay, and they receive zero. The haircut is 100% if the government defaults on its one-period debt. Now, this is in terms of rescheduling, this is the assumption that if you default, you go all the way and you pay nothing. So now we're going to calculate what this price has to be, this so-called risk-neutral price. When a government is expected to default with probability delta, the expected value of a promise to pay one period consumption next period is not 1. It's 1 minus delta. So then that means the discounted expected value of a promise to pay next period, B, is Q, not 1 over 1 plus R, but 1 minus delta over 1 plus R. And this is the default probability. So this model is actually going to determine, we want to know is how does the government set delta? That's our question. That's our question. So let's turn to that. So this is a government that's going to decide whether or not to pay or not. Now, remember from our discussions of the United States in the 1780s and the 1790s, for one reason or another, because of the institutions under the Articles of Confederation and then the revised institutions under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government did not pay. The continental government did not pay in the 1780s, but did pay something in the 1790s. And that affected essentially Q. And remember Alexander Hamilton, if you actually read what George Hall recommended, the report on public credit by Alexander Hamilton, he's talking about, quote unquote, lowering interest rates that will have to be paid, essentially by increasing the probability that we'll actually pay. That's what's on Hamilton's mind. So this model is about that. So here's in this little model what the government chooses. At each point in time, remember in the Friedman model, there was no choice. You had to repay. Government, when the consumer borrowed, whoever was borrowing, they repaid. That was built in. There's perfect enforcement. Well, here there's no enforcement. well, the only enforcement is the consequences that you endure. So this is a model of what we're going to have, what those consequences are, and then how the government responds, what choices it makes in the face of those consequences. This is all about the incentives to repay. So what the government's going to do is they're going to choose between defaulting and not defaulting. So defaulting means, we have to say what that means. It means declining to repay all of its current obligations. You could make a different kind of model, and you could say assumption here, you could say it's going to repay half of it or 3/4 of it, but Arellano assumes it pays nothing. That's what default means. If the government defaults in the current period, its consumptions equal current output. It can eat its current output. That's one consequence. I guess it's a good consequence, but a sovereign default has two further consequences. First, output immediately falls from Y to HOY. And this is her way of saying, well, if you don't pay, some bad things are going to happen to your potential output. Various things you're going to get cut off from trade credit. You're going to cut off from a lot of international trade. So HOY, how much less it is than Y, is reflecting the punishment that the market economy, world market economy, dishes out to you for failing to pay. And output is going to return, you're going to get HOY for as long as you're still don't have access to international credit markets. So this isn't just a one-period punishment, it's going to be a punishment that endures. And then the second thing is the country loses access to foreign credit markets. Now we ask the natural question, well, how long do you lose access? Forever? That's one kind of punishment. That's one possibility. It's not empirically relevant because in the 19th century and 20th century, countries repeatedly defaulted. Argentina might be one that comes to mind. Don't mean to pick on Argentina. Other countries have. But regained access to the credit markets. So how do you get back in? Well, Christina Arellano is going to make a very simple but powerful assumption. She's going to say each whenever you're in a state of default, if you were in a state of default last period, you get a probability of theta of getting back in the market. So if you're out of the market, if you're out of the international market, with probability 1 minus theta, you stay out, but with probability theta, you get in. This is kind of this. This is just exogenous. This is probability theta. So with probability 1 minus theta, if you're out, you just stay in, you stay out. But with probability theta, you leave the exile and come back in. That's going to do it. So we're going to describe an equilibrium of this model. So this equilibrium is going to have some choices. It's going to have some budget constraints or conservation equations, and it's going to have some restrictions on this price that we're after. So so here's the deal. An equilibrium is going to be a set of interest rates on a sovereign debt, a random sequence of government default decisions, and an implied flow of household consumption such that, well, consumptions and assets are going to satisfy the budget constraint. The government, that's the decision maker, it's going to maximize household utility. It's going to do the best thing for its citizens. So taking into account the resource constraint, it's going to take into account the effects of its choices on the price of bonds. it's going to realize that its behavior is going to influence the price of bonds that it faces. And remember, that's what Alexander Hamilton was talking about. He was saying that we can affect that price by our choices. And then the consequences of defaulting now for future net output and future borrowing and lending opportunities. And what this is, that's the H, and that's the theta. That's what this is about. So the interest rate on the government's debt includes a risk premium sufficient to make foreign creditors expect on average to earn the constant risk-free international interest rate. So the vision here is the international creditors are holding a portfolio of loans from these sovereign countries. Okay. So let's go through the timing of this. It's a pretty neat model. So to express what's going on is, here's what goes on. The government, we made B its assets, so minus B is its debt. That's just a convention. So the government enters a period with some initial assets or debts that it has to, it may or may not pay. Then it observes the current output, and then it chooses either to, what does it choose? Its choice is it's going to default. That's going to have some consequence. Or it's going to honor its debt. It's going to pay its debt. We could say pay. And set next period's asset level. Well, I guess when we say honor, it's actually going to, here, it's going to receive or pay. And set next period's assets or debt to that. So we're going to find out what this, we're going to formulate this in terms of some value functions. We're on the way to doing dynamic programming here, a little dynamic programming. Don't get scared. It's going to make a lot of sense. We're going to have value functions and the state variables. So state variables are, that's just what state variables are, they're just a description of the current situation of the decision maker. So the current situation of the decision makers are the asset level or debt level that it has coming in and the level of income for this period. Remember, the income is evolving according to this Markov chain. It's random. And we're going to have three state variables. So V of B, that's the value function. That's the optimum value of the whole problem. So it's the optimum value of the government's problem when at the beginning of a period it faces a choice whether to honor or default. It hasn't decided yet. Now it has two kind of sub-value functions. VC is the value of choosing to pay obligations falling due. So this is going to pay. C means continue. There's a typo. And VD is the value of choosing to default. So VC and V depend on B, but VD doesn't. And the reason is VD does not depend on B because so this is Arellano's assumption. When you default, your debt's wiped out, and if and when you ever get back to the credit market, international credit market, your net foreign debt is reset to zero. Now, we could change that assumption, and people do change that assumption when they apply this to Argentina, because when Argentina got back in, its debt wasn't set to zero. It was set to some haircut. So this is a haircut of 100%. We could change the model to have a less severe haircut. Okay, so good. So now we could actually say what we could actually say what the value of defaulting is. So here's the deal. The value of default, what do you get? I'll just write this out, and you could stare at these a little bit. Well, you get the utility of today's output, but you don't get potential output because you've defaulted, so you're punished with this H function. That's what you get today. And then tomorrow, okay, so tomorrow, it's kind of, you might be lucky, and with probability theta, you re-enter the debt market, and you have zero debt. And that's tomorrow's income. Or you might be unlucky, probably unlucky, if you're me. You don't get back in, and your value function is what you are associated with default again. You've defaulted. And this is just the transition probability. That's the probability that you go from where you are today, from where you are tomorrow, and you just add up. This integral is just adding up across tomorrow's possible states. So this is the value of default. And the key thing is, the key thing is that's if you get back in to the credit market and your new debt is zero. If you don't get back in, that's your value. So what's the value of paying? The value of paying is, we're calling this is the value of continuing. How much do you get to eat? This is just the budget constraint. You get Y plus B minus whatever you borrow, and you decide how much you're going to borrow. You're going to make the optimal choice of how much to borrow. And then tomorrow, that's what you get today. You face that interest rate. There it is. You choose, what are you choosing? You're maximizing over this object. And then tomorrow you get, well, that's tomorrow's debt that you're going to be bringing. So you're deciding how much debt you're going to borrow. And then that's going to be your income tomorrow. And you're just multiplying that by those probabilities. So that's the so-called Bellman equation associated with paying. And then, so what's the relationship among these value functions? Well, the value function for the whole problem is the maximum, and this is going to be, what's the maximum? Pay or default. That's what you're doing. Those are your two choices, pay or not pay. So you get, this is the value if you pay, this is the value if you don't pay. So the whole thing is the government's deciding to pay if it gets more value. That's the really the expected discounted utility of consumption. If there's more value for its citizens by paying than for not paying. It pays only if it wants to. And so the government is obviously going to choose to default whenever the value of paying is less than the value of not paying. That's the model. This is a model where, so given that that's the situation, what we find is that as a function of B prime, whatever the government chooses, there's a default probability. We could compute it by this formula. And I don't care if you know about the details of this, but you can see this one is a so-called indicator function. So this indicator function means it's equal to 1 if you don't pay. It's equal to 0 if you pay. And by using this little function, you can calculate what the default probability is. So now that we know the default probability, if we know the default probability from what we did earlier, we know that the price is going to reflect the default probability. So the higher the default probability, the lower the price. In other words, the lower you get by making fewer goods you get today by promising to deliver goods tomorrow. If you pay, that price goes down. the value of your, makes sense. If you default more, the value of your promises to pay next period go down. That's it. So that's the whole model. And the heart of it is this theory of when it's in the interest of the country to pay. And the two key things are this H function, which tells you how much your output goes down when you're cut off from international credit markets, and theta, the probability that you're going to get back in. So these are the consequences of default. And those feed in to your choice of a default probability, and those feed in directly to that price. So a definition of an equilibrium is just going to be a pricing function, these value functions, and a choice function of the government tells it when it's going to default or not. And an asset accumulation equation that's telling you how you go from B, this wide pair, into the next period, such that everything works out. The Bellman equations are satisfied, meaning people are optimal. The pricing function fits together with the decision rules, and the value function, the price function satisfies this equation. So everything fits together. Okay, well, that's kind of it. So I'm not going to ask that, we're not going to go over this, but in the quant-econ lecture, there's a little Python computer program that lets you experiment with this equilibrium. It computes the equilibrium for various values that you will set in. And in particular, so it will compute default probabilities, and it will compute this function Q as a function of H and theta. The inputs into this are going to be H and theta. Just like look, if Alexander Hamilton were here, he actually had a model like this in his mind. He's actually said, if we somehow changed H or theta to change our behavior, it's going to affect Q. And he wanted to raise Q. He wanted to lower the default probability, the default premium on U.S. debt, and he succeeded in doing it. So there's a description here. You can, if you're interested, you can maybe this summer, if you ever want to know how to compute this. Well, here's the Python code, and you can find it on quant-econ. I'm just going to jump ahead. We're going to use the code. Here's the kind of thing that we get. So we actually did this relates to our earlier lecture on a Markov chain, a two-state Markov chain for income. Income could be either high or low, and there's some Markov transition probability for going from low to high and high to low. So there's a 2x2 matrix that tells us the transitions between high and low. And then what we did is we computed the equilibrium bond price schedule, and there's two of them. One is for when income is low, and one is for when the blue one's for when income is high. And so what's on this graph is with this discrete state, it turns out that the government only wants to choose discrete numbers but anyway, so here's what happens. So when the bond price is when income is low, the green line, what this says is that the more so look at this, when look at this. When B is positive, that means you're not borrowing at all. You're holding assets. The bond price is, there's no discount at all. But when you start issuing more and more debt, meaning you go this way, what happens when income is low is the discount on your debt becomes more and more severe as we go here. So we're going south here. What the discount is depends on the income level. When income is high, the discount falls off more slowly than it does when income is low. Makes a lot of sense. So that's what this graph means. So a little explanation about this. We made a finer grid here. This is just a computational thing. It's basically the same message, but just a finer grid on B. So the way we approximated these continuous functions is we use step functions. That's all that's going on here. So what the graph shows, higher levels of debt induce larger discounts. Now that has to be that higher levels of debt, what this is telling you is, if you think a little bit, higher levels of debt and lower income induce higher discounts. And it's got to be, the reason has to be is the default probability is greater. And that's what this says. This is the whole message. We actually computed some value functions. I'll go by this. These are basically instruments. You can look at this if you want. Those are instruments for finding out what the intermediate objects for finding out what the best thing to do is. Now this is a so-called heat map. My friend John Stachersky loves heat maps. What this shows is the probability of default as a function of how much you borrow and your income. And to read this, the default probability is the redder you are, the higher your default probability. The bluer you are, the lower you are. So look how this looks. If B prime, if you're actually not borrowing at all, your default probability is 0. You want to be repaid. But then as you issue more and more debt, or as your income gets lower, your probability of default increases. That's what's happening. So what this tells you is the probability that you're going to default tomorrow. See, okay, so what is this probability of default? So what the probability of default is going to mean is, what it's going to mean is, what is this influenced by? This graph is influenced by H, theta, and the Markov chain. Just think about that. Because the Markov chain tells you the given income level today, how is that correlated with an income level tomorrow? So this tells you everything. And now we can take the model and run a simulation. This is what Arellano is interested in doing because she wants to study Latin America. So there's output. There's foreign assets. By the way, they're negative, so this country's always borrowing. This period right here, it's clear that we got to a point where the government defaulted. Government defaulted right in here, and that's why these default periods, you're not borrowing anything right there. So there's 2 default periods. And then here's the bond price. So there's periods here where where the bond goes to a big discount. So that means the country's facing really high interest rates it wants to borrow because of default premium. Well, so that's it. So, so this generates some interest rate series that look a lot like sovereign debt problems, look a lot like sovereign experiences with countries that have had sovereign debt problems. So this is the end of our discussion of Arellano's model. And my purpose in discussing this was how it links to what we talked about on the in the first lecture about question is, should a government pay its debts? Well, Arellano's model is a particular model of that. It's a model about the causes and the consequence of government choices of paying or defaulting. So, thank you.